Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the sixth webinar in our Get in Shape webinar series, a series designed to help financial advisors and financial advice businesses get in shape for the new financial advice regime. It is my pleasure this morning to welcome back two familiar faces. We have Karty Mayne from Rosewill Consulting and Steve Burgess from Refinery here to give us their expertise on the topic of redesigning your advice process. Because as the needs of the regulations change, this is an opportunity for you to dig into your advice process, evaluate it on the basis of the new duties and the new requirements, and potentially challenge and make some small changes. So that's the focus of today's webinar. Before we go into today's webinar, just a little recap from what we had last week. Last week, we heard from the Financial Markets Authority, the Ministry of Business Innovation and Employment, and the Code Working Group. So they had a discussion around the FMA. John Boddicker and Derek Grantham were talking about what was going on in licensing, the number of transitional licenses that have been issued and their flow across the country and those sorts of things. The ministry were talking us through the disclosure regulations, and Angus from the Code Working Group was filling in with details about how we need to comply with our duties and things around the Code of Conduct. That webinar is available to watch on the Financial Services Council YouTube channel, and you can always find it on the Get in Shape website. You'll find links to those as well as the way to get invited to future webinars in this series. I'll be monitoring the chat and the Q&A this morning, so if you have any questions, please fire them through into the Q&A. I'll then pass them on in writing to Karty and Steve, who'll be watching so they can pitch in and bounce off each other and answer the questions as we go. But my focus on the Q&A and the chat means that they can focus on what they're saying. So please go for it and ask questions as we proceed through the webinar. Don't hold them through to the end. And we'll look forward to getting started. I'll hand it over to Karty. Thank you, Karty.
Thanks, Mark. Morning, everyone. So, look, I hope we've got a pretty good lineup for you this morning, talking about redesigning the advice process and what it might look like in the new world. What we thought we'd touch on is a bit about some of the new obligation and how things are changing and how you might adopt some changes to the nature and scope of advice, touch on a couple of the areas of the advice process, bring you up to date with some thoughts on things like analysis and research and replacement advice, what a good recommendation looks like, and talk a bit about the digital element, which is obviously an important part of our new world, and record keeping. So that's sort of pretty much our lineup. So if we kick on with the first topic, which is really the source of your new obligation as far as advice goes. So you've now got, in the new world, you'll have a duty to comply with the code. And the code itself has part 2, which is all about having the competence, knowledge and skill for the advice that you give. And in particular, I just want to point out Code Standard 8. So that's that you must have the particular competence, knowledge and skill for the product advice. And that's sort of where we're really sort of focusing some of our comments today. So if you read that code standard and unpick that, you have to apply capabilities that meet the New Zealand Certificate in Financial Services Level 5 outcomes. So what that means is if you unpick the Level 5 outcomes, they walk you through the 6-step advice process. So that's really drilling it right down into that's where the obligation is going to come from for you to have to demonstrate that you follow the 6-step advice process going forward. Now, of course, it doesn't fit perfectly with every type of advice scenario. So to a certain extent, you're going to need to customize it to the type of interaction that you're having with your client, the type of advice that you're giving. So we're going to sort of walk you through that a little bit this morning. So I hand you over now to Steve, who's going to actually just give you that high-level summary of that 6-step process.
Hello, everybody. Thanks, Karty, and thanks, Mark. It's great to be here, chatting with everybody and hopefully providing a little bit of value. As Karty noted, I'll be going over the 6-step advice process. And I think one of the exciting things right now is, as much as everybody's talking about licensing, is the evolution of technology and how that's starting to impact how advisors give advice. And it ties right in to the advice process. So in terms of the advice process, what we like to see when we look at files is an advice process that tells the whole story. We like to think about it like reading a book. So everything starts at the beginning, and by the end, it's all tied up. And it should really exist in a format that the advice process in itself exists on its own, that there should be nothing left in the advisor's head, and that there's nothing left verbally elsewhere. So as we go through the advice process, a lot of you are probably familiar with it. You want to establish the goals and the relationship with the client. Make sure you gather enough data to support whatever that scope might be. So whatever products or goals are important to your client, you need to gather the data to support that. Analyze that data and make sure that you've considered all different possibilities. I would like to say we'll actually dive deeper into some of these as we go along. Making the recommendation, so whatever format you're going to do that in, make sure that you deliver cohesive advice to the client, and you've got good record keeping around that. Implement the advice, and then the last step, which is monitor and review as you move along. Moving on to the nature and scope. So this is quite important, and this is usually where we start off the process with a lot of clients. We do know that as much as the 6-step advice process, it's very linear, that this doesn't always happen in the way, in a simple format, and sometimes it's much more complex. But generally what you want to do is you want to ensure that you establish the nature and the scope of the advice. So that means you want to obviously have that discussion with the client, the products or the goals or their needs moving forward, depending on the type of advice. So in the difference between the regimes, you're seeing it go from personalized, limited, or class, or no advice, and it's shifting to advice or information only, and then you've got the digital advice overlay. And in various aspects of this, you're going to have the ability to use digital tools much more so than you've had in the past. And one of the things we really like to emphasize here is that the fact find and the needs analysis need to match up, tie into the scope. So whatever you've originally discussed with the client, that should be something that you see throughout the course of the advice. And even if you go through this process and the fact find and that scope changes, you do still need to document that and note that so we can read that story and see that full story. I will pass off to Karty. Oh, sorry, no, I'm going on. And in this stage, you've got to analyze the client's personal situation and research options. So part one of that is the fact find and the needs analysis exercise. And like I said, one of the things we like to see in this is consistency. And part of that is the tools you use. So a lot of advisors have fact finds, and then you have kind of needs calculators and or, different investment tools to determine someone's risk tolerance and those types of things. It's great when we see those consistently used over a period of time, so you get similar outcomes with those tools. That's quite important. As we move on to the research stage, you want to review the suitability of the current products. Very important, especially if you're doing replacement business. Review the suitability of the current providers, the options available, and the pros and cons. And you want to drill down the work out to the preferred option. One of the really important things in this phase is to make sure you spend your time to tie the research and the analysis into that scope, and that carries on throughout this. If you are doing replacement business, the suitability of the current products is very important, but it's also a little bit of a step further in terms of how much do you know about that product, and that should carry on through that comparison and be quite detailed. I will pass over to Karty now.
Oh, thanks, Steve. So the research is a really important component. So this is why I guess we're going to spend a bit of extra time on this, because often this is where you can run into trouble when you're having your advice reviewed, if you just really can't understand the logic that's gone in behind the recommendation. So when you think about the purpose of research, we had that picture of the funnel on the previous slide. It's really drilling it down, all the different options that are out there in terms of drilling it down till you get the best solution, the best recommendation for your client. And that includes the process to investigate the best provider. Now, some of the things that we see when we're reviewing statements of advice or written advice is that often there will be, if there's a change to the advice, say the client wants an additional product, the inclination for the advisor is to change everything. And I think that is very dangerous for the advisor, that really you need to demonstrate why the existing provider, why you can't add on an additional product and still keep them with that same provider. You need to give a rationale if your recommendation includes changing the provider. Now, yesterday I was also talking to Alan Ray from Quote Monster, because obviously they're the experts in the world of research and talking to the people who do this for the living. He says that quite often they see advisors using research to justify their recommendation, whereas that's not the purpose of research. The purpose of research means that you need to look at, the world of opportunity that's out there and look at, well, what's going to be right for my client, because you know them best, having been through that needs analysis and fact-finding process. So there's a lot of ways to do research now. I hear some advisors do have their own manual process. Some of them use those sort of online tools. The main thing is that you need to have a methodology that you can demonstrate or justify to your compliance person or independent reviewer or the regulator if they come to review your files, to demonstrate what sits behind that research. Is it values-based? Is it independent? Can you really stand behind it? So create a process, but make sure that you understand the process that you've got in place, especially if you're using somebody else's. We would consider that to be outsourcing a function. Okay, so we'll move on now to the important issue of replacement business. So back in 2018, the FMA did an important thematic review on QFEs, qualifying financial entities, which is really very similar to what a FAT licensee will be in the new world and similar type of obligations. So this is the entity that takes oversight and responsibility for the advice that's given on its behalf. And in this report, FMA say a particular feature of insurance products is that consumers will not know that they've been missold the product until it's too late. So if you read this report, pretty much FMA is banging its fist on the table and saying, guys, you need to step up and do better in this area. And it has some very concrete recommendations and expectations that if you're going to become a FAT licensee, I suggest that it's critical that you look up this report and read it through, because this is the type of expectation that the FMA will have on you for overseeing replacement business advice as a FAT licensee. So on our next slide, we talk a bit about, well, what are the risks? Sometimes advisors say, well, we don't really see what are the risks of replacement business. It could be a whole range of risks. So it could be that the claims are denied, that they lose some sort of benefit that they might have already had on their current provider. The big one for me is the increased likelihood of exclusions or limitations or loadings, particularly when you get to my age group. You want to be very careful when you're changing providers, because life has a way of catching up with you. All those old illnesses and injuries and so on sort of lead to long-term effects. So you've got to be pretty careful that you understand that. And the other risk that we don't have here, we talk here a lot about the risk to the client, but what about the risk to the advisor? So at the moment, I've got a situation of an advisor who's being reviewed by one of the product providers because of poor disclosure or non-disclosure. And yet the advisor believes that they've taken every opportunity to really reinforce the expectations of disclosing everything, going through and revising all your history. So there is a lot of expectation on the advisor here to make sure that the client really remembers and talks about everything in their history. So think about not just the risks here to the client, but think about the risk to the advisor as well if you don't capture everything. But also when you do replacement business, you know, we've got to make sure that we take a balanced view of the world, because there could be an awful lot of benefits to the client for replacing. And we don't want to lose sight of that in our worry about being able to show the evidence of a rationale for making the recommendation to replace the business. So there's all sorts of things like better policy wording, more updated medical conditions. You know, the provider has a lot better cover, a lot better accessibility or claims ratio. So at the end of your recommendation, your ideal situation is what we're now calling good customer outcomes, that they're in a better position than they would have been if they'd stayed with the existing provider. But in terms of that, now you need to demonstrate, which, you know, we talk about show with evidence. Make sure that you can put all the rationale, the analysis that you did, all the research that you did. Don't just do the research behind the scenes and say, oh, I've done that, and come up with the recommendation. These days, you've really got to include the features and benefits of each of the products, the different conditions or options that they have within them, and also set out any of these sort of key type risks that the client could be exposed to. Because at this stage, particularly with something like insurance advice, where you haven't yet been to the underwriter, you won't know what any of those potential exclusions or loadings might be at this stage. So it's important to make aware to your client in that stage of the advice process. Okay, so I'm now going to flick over to Steve, because the logical thing now is, well, what does a good recommendation look like?
Yes, thanks, Karty. And this is obviously one of the more important documents the client will receive, and also from an advisor's end, one of the more important communications and record to keep for an advisor to ensure you've got a compliant business. So a good recommendation, and I think we've kind of touched on the theme of that, is it should address all the client's goals and objectives. So everything that was noted in the scope, even if that's changed through the process. So as an example, if somebody originally said, oh, I'd like trauma, and that's come out, that should come out. One thing we see a lot of examples of is somebody that will, as an example, be looking for KiwiSaver and risk. And you'll see a statement of advice that deals with KiwiSaver, and then they'll say, oh, the risk was dealt with by someone else. However, that's not reflected in the statement of advice or the recommendation. So that's what we're looking for in that space. You should just note we've dealt with that separately, or we referred that on to someone else. It's quite important to complete that story. And then you want to set out the benefits, the impacts, and the other strategies and risks. And as Karty was going over with replacement business, one of those things is you need to compare the good and the bad. Sometimes by moving a product or taking one product over another product, you need to look at the variables and say, well, these are the benefits, but you also need to include in these are the primary features that you're going to be losing. Which is quite important, because there's often a to and fro in terms of that, and it's important to show that. And if there are valid alternative strategies, you need to show that. One of the things we notice is that it's very inconsistently done in the industry. Some statements of advice will document all the options, and others will work through that before the statement comes up with a final recommendation to the client outlining the different, the final strategy that is going to go to that client. And it's okay to go in either direction, and but it's quite important that you call that out or anything else you've considered. And then also you want to know why. So if you do have those alternatives in one document, you do need to have something that summarizes why you and the client have come to that, whichever alternative you've come up with. Quite important as you go through that process to see what the end looks like. And then obviously looking at the differences between the current position and the proposed position, if it's relevant to the advice, and often that's that replacement business space. And you do want to note those things. You do, like I said earlier, you do want to note this is what you're gaining and these are the potential risks. And especially in that replacement business space, you need to be very upfront and ensure that the client understands that there are potential risks there. And Karty's gone over those. And then provide the source for the basis of your advice. That's quite important, is why you're making the advice, and back that up in there. So that should be quite substantive, in terms of this is the advice, but this is why we're making the advice, and tie that back into that needs analysis and that scope in terms of what analysis you've done, how it meets the client's goals or needs. A lot of times when we're reviewing this, one of the things we find is there's a very big difference in terms of quality. Some of the issues we see are you can really tell the advisors that rely on cutting and pasting between the documents. We'll often see different names in there, or at times you'll see a piece of advice and then it'll switch out to another provider all of a sudden because it has been cut and pasted. So it's one of those things in terms of best practice. What we love to see is either peer reviews or paraplanners. They're absolutely fantastic in terms of just picking up those little things that advisors sometimes miss. A really important practice. Every business should have some type of peer review or some type of review to make sure those little things get caught. As an example, we were reviewing a case recently, and going through it, oddly enough, it was missing the actual advice, but yet it was still delivered to the client. And we went back and the advisor said, oh, I thought I had put that in there, but didn't double check. So those are just some of the things, having that peer review, having that, not only peer review, using a paraplanner, an absolutely fantastic approach to it. And I think it adds something to the client value and underlying what the client gets as well. A lot of paraplanners have fantastic credentials, do an absolutely great job. Another thing I think I'd be remiss to not touch on here, digital tools. People are using a lot more digital tools in that space. And that really makes sure that you get everything in there that you need in there, which is really valuable. I'll be switching to the next slide now, on to implementation. And that's one of the areas that myself, when we're reviewing files, that we find there's not the communication you'd like to see. One of the things we tend to notice is you're reviewing a file and somebody's got really good comprehensive advice that covers everything. Somebody's done a really good fact find. They've nailed the scope. Just absolutely great statement of advice. And then all of a sudden you see what was actually implemented and it looks nothing like that. And there's very little, there's just a hole between there where you have no idea what's actually happened. So as you're going through that underwriting process, you have to make sure that you're communicating that and you're meeting your record keeping obligations. What we like to see is either, that kind of electric communication, either email. One of the things we're seeing a lot more communication with is via messenger services. However you want to record that still needs to be recorded. If you want to go in and make a manual file note summarizing those, or if you just want to take screenshots and fire them into your CRM, either or. But you need to have that documented, what happens in that stage. And especially in the replacement business space, if you're going to have actual structural changes to the advice, you're going to need to potentially consider revisiting the advice. One of the things we've done we find this quite often, is you'll have that replacement business advice, and some give better comparisons than others. And advisors obviously come out and said, we feel it's best to go in this direction. And then post underwriting, somebody's got an exclusion or somebody's got an excess. And then you do the comparison, you're saying, these seem almost the same. Or, in your statement of advice, you said you're doing it because it's more financially viable for the client. But then there's an excess on, and it's actually $100 more expensive, but you haven't gone back and revisited that decision-making process. So that's quite important in that space. Anything with exclusions, excesses, we want to see why you continued on with that advice, why it's still suitable for the client, and use your best judgment. But if there's a material change, loop back in and check in with the client. And sometimes you should actually be providing additional advice if that's really truly a material change and it impacts the client's decision-making process. I will pass over to Karty to talk about limited or no advice.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. So remembering under the new regime, we're moving from having personalised advice and class advice to really just advice. And what we're seeing already in the current regime is some advisors limit their advice so much that they're at risk of not meeting their obligations. So I guess I just really wanted to really caution you that particularly when the new regime kicks in, I think you need to be very careful if you take your head down that route. What I see at the moment is some advisors limiting the advice to say, no, we won't do any comparison, i.e. we won't do any research. But really what the purpose, I think, of limited advice is when you have a situation where you may have already given a full set of advice to your client, maybe 6 months later they want to come back and make a simple change. You don't need to go through that whole advice process again. So absolutely, having a limited advice process is perfectly acceptable. The same way in, say, the investment world, where you may have done a comprehensive plan or for the client, and then later on they give you a simple notice that they just want to do execution only on a particular acquisition or divestment or something. So there are places for it, but I think you really need to think back to the purpose of nature and scope of your advice. Is that's where you really work out with the client what type of advice that you're going to give them, what is in scope, i.e. what I will advise on, and what is out of scope, what I won't advise on. And that's really your safety net. I think over-limiting your advice, and in particular trying to limit the advice in such a way that it's trying to ring-fence your obligations, I would suggest is a very dangerous way to go in the new world. So make sure that you use that nature and scope of advice very carefully and use it wisely. Okay, so we're going to have a bit of a chat now in the next few slides. So the next one is about the role that digital tools play, and Steve's touched on this, and we're going to bring, I guess, our own views on this. But more and more we see the role that digital tools are playing, and this is where the world seems to be moving to. So there's a number of businesses that are building their own, and there's some ones that are commercially available as well, that are now building in the whole end-to-end advice process, including, a form of a statement of advice or written advice in the end. So from my perspective, I think they're really great tools, because what I see so far is very clean documents that are coming out with very simple, easy to understand language, very good rationale, very compliant documents, because they go through a process to make sure that they are compliant. But I guess on the other side, always bring that balanced argument, is that I think you need to be very careful that you don't go with an over-templated approach. Now, this isn't just limited to digital tools. I see this with manual templates as well, where the advisors are just not taking enough care to fill it out and really customize it to the client, taking shortcuts. And when we do compliance reviews and we ask them why, they go, well, yeah, we know we're taking shortcuts, but nobody's looking over our shoulder, so we're getting away with it. Well, under the new regime where the FAT licensee is responsible for overseeing the advice process, that sort of behaviour really won't be acceptable anymore. So I guess my recommendation is get in now and get some of your advice processes reviewed so that you can get the feedback and help that you need and make the changes that you need in good time for the new regime. Steve, what are your thoughts on digital tools and the role that they're playing now? You find it easier to do a file review?
It does make it easier to do a file review, certainly. One of my thoughts with the digital space, and we're quite big fans of the digital space, is that it allows you to kind of have a lot of information kind of that's going to consistently be there. But as Karty was saying, you have to still customize it to the client. So it's got to be specific to the client and specific to that full advice process. One of the things I think we see with advisors is it doesn't reduce your regulatory burden. It should just make it a bit easier for you to navigate that space. And you're less likely to make mistakes. In talking to advisors, one of the things I think sometimes advisors get a bit stuck on is what certain systems can't do. And there's very few systems that are 100% perfect. We like to think of it as, oh yeah, it actually fits really well for this 60, 70% of clients. And maybe you need another solution, but the 60 or 70% of your clients, those are the ones you're going to deal with all the time. And that's quite important. Look at them for what they do work and not what they don't. But one of the things we really like, especially with the fact find process and kind of moving through, is those prompts to get that information, to get more detailed information, because sometimes advisors just aren't comfortable asking certain pieces of information, but they get that reminder and they say, oh, actually, yes, I'll ask that. And it helps them give the advice. So I'd say really, if you're comfortable with it, embrace it. But as Karty was saying, make sure, you still have to customize it. But find what works for you. There's a lot of solutions out there. And it's quite interesting how the world's changing in that space. And quite exciting in the next. One of the things, everybody's focused on regulation change, but the technology changes we're seeing are just tremendous and going to be pushing best practice well beyond where it's been the last couple of years, which I think is a really exciting opportunity. And it also gives you, in a lot of cases, it makes it easier to work with others and provide assurance that you are giving good outcomes to clients. If we want to hop over to the next slide. This is one of the things we were looking at and how you actually deliver advice. And that's changing as well. A lot of your businesses and our businesses changed quite quickly a few months ago. And we went to Zoom and we went to more of these tools that are driving us online and digital. And it's forced us to do kind of 6 years of change in 6 weeks. And it's not only us, our customers have adapted to it as well. We've seen a lot of benefits from it, even though it's still really important to get in front of your clients. But what we're noticing is that clients and advisors are wanting advice delivered in other ways. You aren't stuck with only the paper format to deliver advice. So you can do it via video, you can do it via audio. But what I would really like to reference is if you're going to do it in another way, you need to do a lot of training. It's actually quite sophisticated to deliver advice in another manner. And you also need to support that advice with other things in terms of other manual processes to get it across. It's really a hard thing to do to give advice via video or, audio. But it can be done in this day and age. So you should be open to that in terms of servicing your clients. We've got down here training. One of my more interesting roles in life was listening to calls between advisors and clients. And one of the biggest issues there is obviously calls can get quite friendly. And you can be discussing the beers you had or some other scenario that aren't necessarily appropriate for the business setting, but you have those conversations. So you have to keep to the point. So you've got to really train your staff or yourself to stick to the scope and the agenda of what you're talking about. Also, diligence, you have to make it a process that's easy to follow. So you have to have your checklist, you have to have your paperwork, you need to know what's going to get sent out to clients, and then oversight. If you're going to do that, you need to have a fair amount of oversight to make sure you're doing it well. What are your thoughts, Karty?
Yeah, no, I think that you covered that really well. The world is changing and we've just got to learn the techniques, you know, to adapt for that change. All right, shall we move on to record keeping in the interest of time? So, look, if you want to save money on compliance, I think record keeping is a really good place to start because this is where you're keeping all the different components of the end-to-end advice process so that you can demonstrate, i.e. show with evidence, all the different steps that you took and everything that collectively makes up your advice. This is still the #1 failing by advisors, is to keep really good end-to-end records. And even the advisors are starting to capture everything. I find now that when they send me files electronically to review, that I get everything. I get a huge amount of things to download and review, and it's not actually always material to me checking the advice. So one of the things that we suggest is have a bit of a process and a bit of an order. Start to think about how you'll make compliance work for you. If you have a simple maybe summary sheet that says, this is how I apply the 6-step process, these are the key documents I use along the way, this is what they name, some sort of have a common naming methodology. Then when I review your files, or Steve or whoever reviews your files, it's very easy for us to pick and choose the documents that we want to look at along the way, which will make it a lot more efficient compliance review process for you. Generally, I like to see at least 3 end-to-end client files per advisor to get a sense of how you operate, how you put together your advice. And then after that, I can normally go pretty much straight to the advice and look at that, and then just go back to the other components as I need it. But really, it's making sure that you keep those records in a way that's really easy for anyone to access, whether it's the FMA for their review, or your compliance or independent person, or your internal peer review. The other thing is that sometimes there are going to be things that you don't necessarily want to keep. So, for example, product provider information sheets that are very generic. A simple way of doing that is you can actually keep an appendix or a list to your statement of advice or your advice document that sets out here all the attachments that went with my advice. And that way you don't necessarily have to use up all your technology storage in order to save them, but you can still definitely reference what they received. But you need to make sure that you put on the date of the document, the type of document that it was, so it's easy to go back and find that original document to demonstrate exactly what was provided with it. But yeah, so there is the new condition now for if you have a transitional license on record keeping. So make sure that you take that one really seriously, because that's your best defense as an advisor. If you want to demonstrate the end-to-end advice process, record keeping is your friend. Steve, any other words of wisdom on record keeping?
Yes, I was just going to kind of, I guess, echo what you've just said, but one of the biggest findings we have is information in advisors' heads. Will come out with findings and file reviews, and then they'll come, but what you don't know, and the reason we don't know it is because it's in their head. Heads are very unreliable.
Very hard to plug a USB stick into someone's head, isn't it?
Yeah, and a lot of times, and Karty and I have been through this number of times, a number of times when you're going back and you're looking at a complaint or you're doing an investigation, sometimes that advisor's gone. If it's 2 years and we're having to rely, if it's 2 years, 4 years, 6 years, and we're having to rely on what's in your head, we're very confident that's not going to be reliable. And, you know, you even see it in the court system now. Witness testimony is not valued very highly. So I'd say make sure you get it on paper. File notes, client file notes are great. One of the things we often see is inconsistency in record keeping. So if you have a person that is able to deliver, support person that's able to keep things consistent, that's exactly what you're looking for. That's all from me, Karty.
Good stuff. Okay, so we're going to run into a wrap up, but we do have a question which I'm going to answer at the same time. So Naomi, if you just want to go into the last slide. So in summary, this applies, it doesn't matter what type of advice you're giving. If you're a mortgage advisor, if you're an insurance advisor, if you're an investment advisor, if you're an advisor on business insurances or asset finance, or this could be a whole range of advice that you give and it's not within the norm, these obligations still absolutely apply to you. So the number one here, where you've got the duties in the legislation to comply with the code, and the code says you need to follow the 6-step advice process. That includes you if you're a mortgage advisor. So that means that you will need to be able to demonstrate what your recommendation was. Now, sometimes this will look different compared to the different types of products that you're advising on. So you may need to form new ways to thinking about how do I actually demonstrate that advice. So I'm working with one group at the moment who are moving towards more of an online type process, and they're creating like a follow-up type letter for their mortgage advisors that sets out, once we've got to the very end, it sets out why the type of loan, why the provider, why the structure of the loan and the type of interest rate was the most advantageous for that client. But I'm also reminding them, end-to-end advice process. You've got to, as well as pointing out the features and benefits, we're still got to have something in there in terms of risks. So say, for example, they were refinancing the loan, they need to understand some of the risks associated with that. We don't live in a perfect world, and everything has got its pros and cons. It's a matter of pointing that out. Agreeing the nature and scope of advice with the client, so important. It's up to you to define and put in writing what we will give advice on and what we won't give advice on. And that's one of your key defence mechanisms in terms of being clear up front with what comes into the scope of that advice. And then, of course, we talked about making sure that you've got a really good way of analysing the client's needs and objectives and showing backed up with some form of research how you've gone through a robust process to come up with the appropriate solution. Steve, do you want to make any sort of high-level comments on the rest of these? Anything else that really sticks in your mind as being super important?
Well, obviously good record keeping, I'd say is one of the standard conditions, but it's all equally important. It all goes to the better you can do it, the more efficiently you can do it, the more consistently you can do it. The better your directors are, the less risk your directors are going to take on in the new world. And that's an important thing to consider.
Perfect. So if I were to leave you with 3 key things in my mind, use your research well, demonstrate the rationale for the recommendation well, and if you haven't had your advice reviewed before, get it reviewed now so that you know what changes you need to make before the new regime kicks in. Remember, it's all about keeping the advisor and the licensee safe in terms of, have we got sufficiently robust policies, procedures, advice processes in place that are going to meet these new obligations. What would be your top 3, Steve?
I would say those are 3 pretty good ones. And I think especially moving forward, it's looking at your business as a director and say, where are my risks and what assurance do I have? A, that I'm meeting the standards and conditions, I've got my policies and procedures in place, and I'm giving good, consistent advice that's in the client's best interest. And I thought there was a good, like when you were talking about limited advice, one of the key points there is it actually in the client's best interest, or because I do know some businesses where they limit the advice because they don't want to take on the risk, but is that in the client's best interest? So always think about what's in the client's best interest. And I believe we're heading over to Mark.
Lovely. Thank you both very much. Just a couple of notes that I've picked up through the course of that webinar. The first thing is that this review of your own advice process is something that you can do now. So spend some time, analyze your process, think about the new requirements. And if you want a place where you can get a summary of what the new requirements are, you can go to navigatingregulation.co.nz. There's a summary there of the requirements in the code, the requirements in the legislation that you'll need to follow as a starting point, and it'll give you links to other places as well. So do this review of your advice process right now. The couple of other notes that I pulled out, one is that this applies to all financial advisors, not just insurance advisors, not just investment advisors. It applies to mortgage advice, it applies to fire and general insurance advice, it applies to all financial advice. The file must stand alone as a story, right from the start of the conversation with the client through to implementation. And any changes that have been made between your statement of advice and the implementation of advice must again be recorded well in your record of advice, in your records, in your record keeping. Another note that I pulled out was that you need to have a very balanced analysis of the client's information. So analyzing both the risks to the client of taking the advice as well as the benefits to the client of taking the advice. So there were a couple of key points that I pulled out of the presentation today. Also keep in mind that you as a financial advisor, as well as in future your financial advice provider, are responsible for your advice. So it's very helpful to have somebody review a couple of your files, whether it be a peer, a colleague in your company, or an independent review from a consultant. Get some feedback, and particularly if you can put a file down in front of them and walk away and they can see the entire story from go to woe, that's what you need to be in a position to be able to do. So get a colleague to review, or a consultant or a peer in the industry to review one of your files, and give each other some feedback and see whether you can get, make sure that you're nice and compliant before this new regime comes into place next March. So a huge thank you to Karty and to Steve. I'd encourage you now just to write in the chat something that you may have picked up from this presentation. So just get your fingers busy, type something into the chat and see that you've picked something up. Our next webinar in 2 weeks' time on the 21st of August is around the technology that's available to make your business more efficient. There were some comments that touched on this today, so that will be expanded on with the sorts of things that are available, and registration details will follow. There's an email on the screen if you want to get yourself registered. Please encourage your colleagues in the industry to follow these webinars. The more people we have following these webinars, viewing them live or viewing them on YouTube after they're recorded, the more we know that we're doing something that's helpful to you. So please encourage other people to come along and join in. And there's a poll available to you now that's asking you for some feedback about this webinar and the sorts of things that you're after for future webinars. So please answer the poll and send us some feedback. Write into chat something that you may have picked up from this. And we hope to see you at the next webinar on the 21st of August. Thank you very much for attending. Thank you again to Karty and to Steve for your expertise. Incredibly valuable. And we'll look forward to seeing you soon. Thanks, everybody.